Vamos dar continuidade ao evento, dando início ao primeiro painel desta manhã. Por favor. Vamos dar início ao primeiro painel do seminário, convidando para coordenador de mesa da Conferência Magna o advogado militante no Rio de Janeiro, conferencista emérito da Emerj, autor de uma dezena de livros jurídicos e 2 obras literárias, Dr. Sérgio Bermudes. Convidamos nesse momento o professor e vice-reitor da University California Irvine School of Law, doutor em Direito pela European University Institute Florença, é autor de mais de 20 obras, dentre as quais destaca-se o livro Acesso à Justiça, escrito em coautoria com Mauro Capelletti. Ultrapassa de 100 o número de artigos, capítulos e ensaios que ele tem publicados. Prêmios, consultorias, contribuições em enciclopédias, palestras, conferências, participações em seminários por todo o mundo. E hoje, na Emerj, para a Conferência Magna, o Distinguished Professor of Law, Dr. Bryant Garth. Dr. Bryant Garth, the microphone is yours.
Bom dia. I have to start by saying I am a little nervous about giving this talk because all of you almost know more about my subject than I do at this point. Ministero folks gave a brilliant exposition of access to justice. So I feel in a way that we've said almost as much as we need to say. But I will nevertheless, because I was invited here, go on with my talk. And what I'm calling my talk today is The Courts and Access to Justice, from the Florence Project to the neoliberal state and beyond. Again, I want to thank all the organizers, in particular, André Gustavo Correa de Andrade, my hosts, Larissa Claire Buckman da Silva, and Lucia Frota Pestana de Aguiar Silva. Thank you very much. Oh. I have had a long career that began with the Florence Access to Justice Project and is focused on issues of equality in law, dispute resolution, and the legal profession. I decided after some thought that my talk here should do at least 2 things. First, I should talk a little bit about access to justice, because that is what I am best known for here in Brazil. And second, I want to praise the work that creates today's occasion, and that is the research that went to Quem Somos, or Magistratura de Queremos, que Queremos. In this very divided world, I do not have any answers about exactly what the outcome will be of the judiciary in the years to come. I share the statement that Justice Salamao said in a recent event about this same book, that we're in a brave new world and we're not really sure where we are going. But it really helps to have a study of who judges are and how they are changing. And so I salute you for the remarkable research. And I also like very much the fact that this research can be compared to the research 20 years ago. So I will talk a little about the research, but understand these are first impressions. I am not an expert on the issues that those raise today. So I will, So I will talk about Queremos, but I want to begin with some autobiography. So the first part will talk about when I was 25 years old, working with Mauro Cappelletti on this Florence Access to Justice project. I worked for 3 years on this project, and I want to return to this personal history because it helped me build a connection to Brazil, thanks very much to the translation of the general report by a young woman, Ellen Gracie Northfleet, who later became Chief Justice. I don't know if the attention to the general report came because of her or came because of Mauro Cappelletti and me. But it is very nice to have an excuse to revisit access to justice today, and I think I can say, with some caveats, that there is a kind of revival of interest in access to justice in the United States. So that will be my first part, is just access to justice. The second part is to tell you what happened to that field in the United States and many other places. There is a story of disappointment with the results of the third wave of the access to justice movement and through the globalization of neoliberalism. Indeed, those who did research on access to justice were often marginalized in the academy and in the bar. I switched my research direction. My more sociological research with Yves Desilets, a French sociologist, on law, empire, neoliberalism, and human rights, in fact, brought me to Brazil for the first time in the 1990s. I will also talk a little bit, just so you know what I'm doing, about our recent research, which is on the rise of corporate law firms, elite law schools, and rising inequality within our societies, but also within law, where there is now what we can call a new legal 1% found in the corporate law firms in the United States, but also in many other places. And the story of rising inequality is also in part the story of more interest in access to justice. The third part of my talk will talk about the details and somewhat about the United States of this revival of concern with access to justice, which comes with important and very welcome changes in legal education. These changes have finally put empirical research and questions of access to justice back on the agenda in the United States. So I start, this is the first part, with autobiography. I was a third-year student at Stanford Law School, interested in issues of social justice. One day I saw a notice on a bulletin board talking about a fellowship in Italy for a project on access to justice. So I applied for the fellowship. I had an interview, and then I went to Florence, and because of some problems that were around Professor Cappelletti at that time, as a young student, I got more and more responsibility in the project and became co-author, as you know, of much of the project's work. But I was the junior author, very junior author, and I was working within a vision that came from Professor Cappelletti. I was lucky to join this project and to be friends with him for many years before he passed away. I could speak all day on that project, but I will not, fortunately for all of you. But I want to talk about three of Professor Cappelletti's important innovations, and going with those innovations, as a little nostalgia for me, I want to talk about three of his favorite quotations about issues of access to justice. First, these are his innovations that I got to share. Professor Cappelletti insisted that the mainly civil procedure scholars who contributed in the volume cite statistics and take advantage of empirical studies. At that time, it was very rare, probably still in many places, rare for law professors to do empirical research. Now it is actually essential in many fields. Second, his vision recognized that the availability of lawyers, the organization of courts, the rules of substantive law, the rules of civil procedure, the ways that people use formal and informal mechanisms to handle disputes, are all connected. They all relate to similar phenomenon. They were not in the three waves of the project, one replacing another, but it was a movement to see the connections and to creatively develop new approaches and innovations to recognize what did work well, what did not work well in the status quo. With respect to civil procedure, which I taught for many years, he loved to quote, and this is my first Cappelletti quote, he loved to quote Franz Klein, the noted Austrian jurist, on the importance of civil procedure. Klein said in 1901, "The squalid, arid, neglected phenomenon of civil procedure is in fact strictly connected with the great intellectual movements of people, and its varied manifestations are among the most important documents of mankind's culture." In other words, issues of civil procedure are at the center of the politics of law. And this was remarkable for Mauro Cappelletti, who was trained in the German style of highly formalistic civil procedure. But he took this inspiration and broadened his domain of study and the techniques and disciplines that he used for this research. Finally, what is especially important was the focus on making rights effective. It was not just access for its own sake, but it was for a positive social program for civil rights, welfare, environmental protection, consumer rights, and other forms of justice. In Cappelletti's other work on civil procedure, and this sounds odd in today's world, he did not hesitate to call this a socialization of civil procedure, to go with the programs of the social or welfare state. He liked to quote, this is his second favorite quote, Learned Hand, a famous US judge, for the proposition, "Thou shalt not ration justice." Justice is not, from this perspective, a market phenomenon, and I'll talk more about that. Finally, the third of his favorite quotations was the famous attack by Anatole France on formal equality, which says, "The law, in its majestic equality, forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. Formal equality of access," he always said, "is not enough to fulfill the criteria of justice in the sense of access to legal rights." This message was a strong one, and it implied judges committed to the mission of making rights effective. They were part and parcel of the system that included alternative dispute resolution. And it was a message that resonated in many places, and including Brazil. The study of judges that we are talking about today noted that the 1990 study that the AMB conducted envisioned, it had kind of as an ideal, much more activist judges in the context of the Constitution of 1998. What I would say, though, is even as we went to press to publish the volumes of the Access to Justice, the activist vision in the books was already losing its force. It was almost out of date at the time that it finished in certain ways. Although, as I will see, I think the message continues. Even as we finished the project in particular, we could see that the third wave of reform which we defined as using a whole range of techniques, especially alternatives to the courts, to help individuals and groups enforce their rights, that move was shifting with the changing political climate. To be sure, there definitely were new forms of experimentation with mediation, arbitration, and mixed combinations of these and other processes, but they seemed to be more about cooling claims of right in exchange for an emphasis on social peace and not social change, rights enforcement, or the implementation of a kind of social state. Only a few reviewers of Access to Justice noticed it, but we wrote in the introduction to Volume 3 of the project that access to justice and its opposite can look very similar. Alternatives to the court can be progressive or regressive from the point of view of the Florence Project. Just because they are alternatives does not make them good necessarily from this rights perspective of the project. And when I left Florence and began teaching in the United States, the situation began to even get worse, I thought. The regressive side seemed to dominate. And in the new era of deregulation, active judges became more and more discredited as going beyond what proper judges should do. Okay. Indeed, there is a story today of a conservative and market-oriented Supreme Court extending the power of businesses to impose contracts on workers, victims of discrimination, consumers, investors, and others that require mandatory arbitration and take away any opportunity to go to court, and also of major importance to join up in class actions to assert their rights. This brings us back to the Anatole France quote that I mentioned. Workers, consumers, and others now have the same formal right as big corporations to make contracts and dispute resolution mechanisms that favor themselves and their rights over the interests of big business. But of course, that is absurd. They do not have any power to make those kinds of contracts. I saw in the United States that my colleagues who wrote about issues of access to justice as neoliberalism became more prominent were not taken seriously as scholars. Their commitment to civil rights and benefits for the needy was labeled, in the words of the economists, rent-seeking behavior. The idea coming from the economists in power was to move away from broad social justice issues in favor of private markets and deregulation. Legal aid from the poor even became less of a focus among the American Bar Association, which also felt like they were being criticized if they promoted this kind of work. I still wrote and researched access-related issues, but I began to focus in my own research on how did we get so far from the access to justice ideal? And why was there such a quick and massive conversion to a new legal and economic orthodoxy? So this is the detour into my own more sociological research. The questions that we began to ask is, again, why was it that lawyers and law professors moved so quickly to the new orthodoxy? How did we develop such institutions as international commercial arbitration to provide a very elite transnational private justice? I won't talk much of this, but some of the research was about Latin America, including Brazil, after the period of authoritarian rule. Written many books with Yves Desilets, my collaborator on these issues, and we have a new one, which I hinted at in the beginning, that also takes on globalization, the role of lawyers, and inequality, focusing on elite law schools, corporate law firms, and the creation of legal 1%. But I won't explore those in this talk, maybe the next talk. But one of the things that we learn from all of this research is something that law professors don't really like to say, and that is that judges and the law ultimately follow political and social power. We cannot expect judges to be activists for the rights of the disadvantaged unless the other branches of the government and the public see that activity as legitimate. The politics of legal change is therefore both of a story internal to the legal profession, and it's of related political and economic change outside the legal field. Now, the new study of the Brazilian judiciary seems to bear this out. Among many other findings, there does not appear, as was noted earlier, any kind of consensus in the judiciary on social justice or going beyond a divided parliament to enhance rights to social groups. Particular judges, of course, may stand out for trying to continue an activist line, but the emphasis in the report, at least, is mainly on the rule of law and making sure that the executive and legislative respect the rule of law. There are some signs of sympathy with a more social agenda, for example, for health, education, and security. But the authors seem correct in stressing that we are in a very different political era, and the judges have very different attitudes and ideas of legitimacy than those that went with a welfare state. There seems to be, and I would like to know more personally about this, a big difference from 20 years ago in Brazil. Now, there are changes taking place in the United States. There are several elements of this kind of revival of access to justice. One, which is very important in my country, is that especially since the last decade of the 20th century, the empirical study of courts and alternatives to courts has improved dramatically. In the United States, the Journal of Empirical Legal Studies was launched in 2005. Brazil has a similar organization and journal beginning in 2014. Law professors now do empirical research, and of equal importance, social scientists have joined them. We have many more studies of courts and alternatives than in the past. And Mauro Cappelletti, as I noted, anticipated this trend. We do not, however, have a study like the Brazilian survey that I know about. But there is much attention in the United States on political affiliations of judges and considerable attention and some debate on the role of diversity within the judiciary. Scholars ask whether more gender and racial diversity leads to bias or whether it helps keep the courts relevant and legitimate because of the absorption of new perspectives and experience. I, of course, believe in the positive value of diversity in gender and race, and also, though, diversity in life experiences. A recent study in the United States, for example, pointed out that our U.S. Supreme Court has a bunch of justices who are divided, very divided politically, but all of them went to the same schools, graduating from Harvard or Yale, and all followed exactly the same elite careers. Very different from the careers of the 99% of law graduates. And maybe this is a problem. There is also systemic research now on the way courts now operate. And part of this shows a kind of political change. The federal courts have made it much more difficult to assert individual and group rights. The federal rules of civil procedure and much case law increases the burdens on class action lawyers and public interest law. More practically, scholars debate the role of research conducted by courts that seeks to, this is about the courts, speed up the courts, and technologies that provide transparency, which is good, for all the rulings that judges make, but this transparency is not shared equally. It helps you understand the courts, but it also opens up possibilities for well-to-do litigants, business litigation in particular, to shop for courts and judges who they think will rule favorably to them. In fact, the very large corporations can, in effect, shop, purchase, look around, find the best product for around the world to find ones that will favor their interests. Big Tobacco from the United States, for example, used Hong Kong's investment treaty with Australia to challenge Australia's regulation of the tobacco industry after Big Tobacco had lost in Australia. It was a way they could re-challenge it, and they lost, but they got close. Now I want to focus on this sort of new revival of access to justice on some research that's not so much about the courts, but that I find quite interesting. One is research led by sociologist Rebecca Sandifer on how individuals who observers would say have legal needs do not see them as legal. They see them as problems, not legal problems. Their perspective is that they are illegal. They exist in ignorance of any legal connection. The problem of access to justice to her is less about costs and more about educating people to know of potential affordable legal or quasi-legal remedies for their problems. But the question of what remedy will help is still open, especially since public efforts to improve access tend to rely on very low-cost alternatives, such as helplines on the telephone or consumer-operated kiosks that allow individuals without lawyers to handle particular claims or defenses. Another feature of this new emphasis on empirical research that I think is very positive is that researchers are doing random experiments where one litigant will go one way and one will go another way, and we see what the difference. So, again, from Rebecca Sandifer, she found that in the courts in New York, where one group randomly was assigned to navigators who were specialists without law degrees, who were there to help people through the landlord-tenant court. And then there were others who just went through without the same help. And the navigators made a much better result in the same kinds of cases than the ones who did not have them. So this was very positive and made up for the lack of lawyers available. Another random experiment done by Harvard law professor Jim Greiner recently compared what happened when a group of low-income divorce seekers were given a self-help kit, do it yourself, to get a divorce, versus a random group assigned to a volunteer lawyer. And they found that the complexity of documents and procedures meant that the group represented by lawyers were 5 times as likely to obtain a divorce in 3 years. And then relatedly, my colleague at Irvine, Emily Taylor Poppy, examined what happens when people try to litigate in the federal courts without a lawyer. The word among the judges was that they take up too much time, they waste our time with bad cases. But what she found was they did not take up too much time, but they almost always lost their cases, and if they ever won a case, they won less money. They were systematically disadvantaged. This and related research from this now flourishing empirical legal studies field is especially compelling on the difficulties that the disadvantaged face every day and how courts may exacerbate that disadvantage. For another example, there is research on how low-income individuals get traffic tickets, can't pay the tickets, go to jail, lose their property, can't get jobs, all in kind of one system that kind of keeps them very disadvantaged. So in sum, on this, there is good news on the quality of empirical research on the courts, but a major theme of the research is a compelling story of how justice is rationed according to the market that favors those with the most resources, how inequalities in the availability of lawyers magnify that disadvantage, and both how difficult it is to mobilize the disadvantaged even to be aware of their rights, and how difficult it is even further for them to act to seek their enforcement. There is research also on structural changes. Klein's observation, the quote I gave you earlier, that civil procedure and politics are related is all too well known today, and the conservative revolution has found ways including changes in the rules of civil procedure, such as those for class actions already mentioned, and conservative judicial rulings to make it much harder for the disadvantaged to get justice. One part of the current situation, as in Brazil, is that many judges at all levels of courts, including especially immigration courts, which are so important, and federal courts generally, are overworked and themselves victims of a very stingy rationing of justice. But here's some more potential good news. Lawyers, bar associations, and reform-oriented groups, such as philanthropical foundations, are mobilizing around access to justice. Now, this is just an example, but I think it's a really remarkable example. Rebecca Sandifer, who I mentioned before, who's a sociologist, struggled even to get tenure in sociology for the work that she was doing. Now, last year, she received one of the MacArthur Foundation's Genius Awards of $1 million for somebody doing research of great interest to society. That shows an increase in the importance of the topic of access to justice. Another one, which I also think is important, is the huge legal publisher LexisNexis, just in the last few months, started sending a daily update to subscribers on, believe it or not, the subject of access to justice. And finally, another indicator is that many of the best young law professors and related social scientists, some of whom I have mentioned, are finally believing that this is a good subject for a legal career. All of that is very positive. But in many ways, Brazil has already kept this topic alive this whole time, so it's nice to see it revived in the United States. And I know two Brazilians, Diego Esteves and Kleber Alves, both defensores públicos do Estado do Rio, who are actually moving ahead to replicate the Florence Access to Justice project and have already made some important strides to do that. But it is very early in this revival of access to justice. The research is growing, philanthropic foundation support is moving ahead, the vision of making rights effective, however, which I told you was one of the key things of the Florence Project, is just not on the reform agenda. It would take a major political change, and that has not happened. The Brazilian study of judges suggests, again, some reformist support with an openness to change in the sense of plea bargaining, more conciliation, mediation, restorative justice, more public education, language that makes procedures more understandable. These kinds of changes are not, they can be important. So these kinds of changes are important, and these are the kinds of changes that the foundation support. So there is lots of activity, but most of the focus on access still today, in the very beginnings of this revival, is underfunded, too reliant on technology, even though there's much that can be done, and most successful when measured by cost savings and by reducing court loads. The research and revival of interest are both positive developments. Part of the project is to try to ameliorate the growing social equality through at least some better access to dispute resolution, bring people at least into the system. So there are some parallels to the Florence Project, but they are parallels to the less activist side of the Florence Project. So now I'm coming to a conclusion, and it will be speculative. From my perspective, which is not shared by everyone, I really would like to see, nostalgia for the past, for many years ago. I would like to see a return to a time when the government and the courts united in reaching out to those who are disadvantaged, bringing them into the courts, and helping them realize their rights. We do not see this in the Brazilian survey, and we certainly would not see it if we had the same survey in the United States. So the big question, and this is where I become even more speculative, is could this ever happen politically? Maybe. Every country is different, but the remarkable social divide today between the haves, the 1% or the 1/10 of 1%, and the have-nots is leading to social conflict and political demagoguery in many countries. It is easy to find examples around the world. The first response of courts is already brave. It is a lot to ask judges to enforce the rule of law when they are under strong political pressure to ignore the rules. My president refers to judges only according to their political affiliation. We have a very conservative court, identified with the Republican Party, which is where the president comes from. But those favoring the rule of law in the United States are counting on this court and courts generally to fulfill their role and restrain the arbitrary conduct of the president. And that's not unrealistic to expect. And I note the Brazilian judiciary, according to the survey, believes that its judiciary depends on a similar role. This may be what the times call for today. But, and this is my last word, there is at least the possibility that politics may also come to embrace, again, some of the welfare state ideals of the Florence Project. The welfare state, we should remember, was an effort to bring dissidents and the poor and those tempted by communism into the society by providing them with programs and remedies for certain inequalities and disadvantages. It was meant to heal divisions. We will need ways in the future to include and support those left aside by the current era of globalization, and maybe there will be a new affirmative role for courts if there is that new politics of inclusion. Thank you.
Very good.
Com a palavra o Dr. Sérgio Bermudes, nosso coordenador da mesa.
Meu querido presidente, senhores ministros, desembargadores, magistrados, eu tomo a bênção ao meu chefe, presidente do Conselho Federal da Ordem dos Advogados do Brasil, Luiz Felipe Santa Cruz, Felipe Santa Cruz, diante de quem nós todos, nós advogados, devíamos nos silenciar, porque ele é efetivamente melhor do que todos nós. Eu vou pedir licença para, arranhando um pouco de inglês, dizer alguma coisa ao professor Bryant. My dear Bryant Garth, it has been said that the two most spoken languages in the world are, one, English, the other one, badly spoken English. I'm unfamiliar with the first one and very familiar with the second one. That's why I'm using it just to thank you for having come to Brazil and to share some of your brilliancy with us, you know, and you, unfortunately, you have not used more time, you know, to make us share with you your ideas. Of course, every time we think of Bryant Garth, we also think of Mauro Capelletti. Mauro was a friend of Brazilian lawyers and jurists, and particularly a very good friend of mine. He, much to my honor, he made me the executor of his will and the trustee of his estate. And he devoted himself, we could say, to access to justice. The word justice in this expression, access to justice, is what we could call a metonym, because the word justice does not only mean the judiciary power, but all the ways of reaching at least a fair trial, which among us, as in the United States, is considered a constitutional guarantee. But after having used this time just to present you the homage of our admiration and of our gratitude for your work towards increasing the jurisdiction worldwide, and to your efforts in preaching the best ways to have access to justice. After that, I'm going to switch to my own language, which I hopefully I speak better than English. Nós acabamos de ouvir uma palestra admirável do professor Bryant Garth, com a sobriedade típica dos professores e juristas de língua inglesa. Ele nos apresentou as suas ideias. Eu costumo dizer que não se pode falar em acesso à justiça sem se falar em Mauro Capelletti, que foi amigo do Brasil, amigo dos advogados brasileiros e, para minha honra e para o álbum das minhas poucas vaidades, meu amigo íntimo, de tal maneira que me fez seu testamenteiro e seu inventariante, apesar dele ficar em Florença e uma parte em Stanford e eu no Rio de Janeiro, não é? Tudo foi o lugar onde eu cheguei, vindo de Cachoeiro de Itapemirim. Para alguns de lá, não é uma remoção, mas eu acho que é efetivamente uma promoção. Mas quando se fala em acesso à justiça, tem que se tomar a expressão acesso à justiça, o substantivo justiça, como uma metonímia, significando não apenas o poder judiciário, mas significando o conjunto de meios necessários para obter a melhor jurisdição possível. Quando se fala, portanto, em acesso à justiça, se fala no judiciário. Na verdade, o acesso à justiça pressupõe a existência de uma justiça acessível. Luiz Felipe Salomão frequentemente diz isso e prega isso. Aliás, conquanto o elogio de corpo presente seja quase um vitupério, como o Eduardo Couture costumava dizer, é preciso que não que se enalteça, mas que se destaque o papel do ministro Luiz Felipe Salomão no aprimoramento da jurisdição brasileira, não só por sua atuação no Superior Tribunal de Justiça, onde ele exerce não apenas a função de prevenir e de compor lides, mas também a função didática dos juízes, que é de explicar, ensinar a nós, os jurisdicionados, o sentido da lei, a vontade da lei, tudo com a finalidade de tornar o processo judicial efetivo. A efetividade do processo está vinculada ao acesso à justiça. Não adiantaria haver facilidade de acesso à justiça se os resultados do processo, desse acesso, não fossem a obtenção não concorressem para a obtenção de uma justiça efetiva, melhor, de um processo efetivo. Então, eu acho que a expressão acesso à justiça é uma expressão que precisa ser compreendida num sentido abrangente, a começar pelo fato de que o acesso à justiça pressupõe uma justiça acessível. E isso nos levaria a várias considerações, inclusive porque nós temos que reconhecer com humildade que as condições da prestação jurisdicional no nosso país são muito precárias, a começar pela deficiência dos postulantes do Poder Judiciário, que somos nós, os advogados, o Ministério Público, os defensores, e as limitações dos prestadores da jurisdição, que são os juízes. Eles, os juízes, vistos por nós, os advogados, como constantemente acontece que nós, os advogados, somos vistos e mal vistos, até, muitas vezes, por eles, os juízes. Mas o importante é que nós mudemos a mentalidade, eu vou falar pouquíssimo, é que nós mudemos a mentalidade, a maneira de ver a jurisdição. O professor Fritz Bauer, da Universidade de Tübingen, pediu uma vez para ver o meu programa, o programa da minha cadeira de Direito Processual Civil, da Pontifícia Universidade Católica, da PUC do Rio, e ele começou a rir. Ele disse, por quê? Eu disse, por que você está rindo? Ele disse, porque você inclui no seu programa natureza da ação judicial, natureza do processo, princípio do duplo grau de jurisdição. Isso não se ensina mais na Alemanha. Eu disse, o que é que se ensina na Alemanha? Ele disse, não, quem quiser saber o que é ação judicial, o que é o processo judicial, que vá à doutrina, mas que não fique na faculdade. Aqui nós temos que ensinar os meios de acesso a uma justiça contemporânea, não a uma justiça que é conhecida. Eu me lembro muito bem dessa frase, uma justiça conhecida com a realidade social. Eis a lição que ministrou Fritz Bauer, que não é diferente da que ministram os advogados americanos. Bryant Garth é, sem dúvida nenhuma, you see, I'm going to skip some flattering remarks about you, in order not to hurt your modesty, okay? Mas, de qualquer maneira, Bryant Garth nos faz com que nós voltemos os nossos olhos para o aperfeiçoamento da justiça, que é um meio pelo qual se aperfeiçoa o acesso à justiça. Então, eu queria agradecer ao nosso querido Bryant Garth a presença dele e a oportunidade que ele abre para nós de pensarmos na justiça efetiva, na justiça que realize, né, realize a paz no sentido mais amplo da palavra. Carnelucci cunhou um lema que foi adotado pelo Papa Pio XII para o seu pontificado, Pax Opus Justitiae, a paz é obra da justiça. E o acesso à justiça visa, em última análise, a promover a paz social. Com essas considerações, que para mim foram breves, mas exaustivas para o auditório, eu abro a palavra aos presentes na esperança, mais que na esperança, na certeza de uma contribuição muito positiva. De maneira que a palavra está franqueada e quem quiser fazer uso dela será muito bem-vindo. Talvez o ministro Luiz Felipe Salomão, né, a todos os títulos, pudesse dizer alguma coisa. Você. O ministro já declinou da sua competência momentaneamente, mas reservando-se para falar depois. Muito bem. Então, quem quer falar?
Neste momento, então, vou agradecer.
A senhora que dá a palavra, não sou eu.
Por gentileza. Agradecemos ao doutor Sérgio Bermudes. Por favor, dê a palavra ao nosso diretor-geral.
Alguém gostaria de falar? Já que o professor Sérgio Bermudes manda aqui, ele é quem está coordenando.
É você que fala?
Não. Eu só estou aqui como, digamos assim, mestre de cerimônias. Mas se ninguém gostaria de falar, eu gostaria de aproveitar esse momento, o professor Sérgio Bermudes, se me permite, de fazer um especial agradecimento aqui Pois não? Quem? Ah, pois não, claro, claro. Do Sérgio Bermudes. Alguém tem microfone? Pode levar lá? Eu vou só pedir que seja breve, porque nós temos que começar o outro painel, tá bom?
Tá bem.
Pois não.
Bom dia, meu nome é Dalfa Amélia de Oliveira, eu sou desembargadora do Tribunal Regional do Trabalho aqui do Rio de Janeiro. E, diferentemente do que acontece, talvez, na justiça comum, onde o acesso é mais dificultoso por conta de recolhimento de custas e uma série de formalidades, na Justiça do Trabalho aqui no Brasil, o acesso é bem razoável. É tão mais além do razoável que nós temos uma que se chama de explosão de demanda, de litigiosidade. Nós temos no Brasil pesquisas, já com índices que realmente são bastante confiáveis, de uma explosão de litigiosidade tão grande que foi necessário, tivemos recentemente uma reforma da legislação do trabalho, onde veio se impôs alguma dificuldade em relação ao acesso, na medida em que impôs aos empregados, quando sucumbentes, o pagamento de custas, de honorários, etc. e tal. Então, o Brasil, nas questões laborais, tinha realmente uma acessibilidade muito grande, a ponto de ter que fazer uma reforma, e isso inspirado em legislação internacional. Já tivemos a oportunidade de fazer alguns encontros na Europa, e de onde copiamos algumas medidas até para evitar litigiosidade sem êxito, que era muito comum na Justiça do Trabalho. Gostaria de saber se o senhor tem conhecimento disso e como isso se processa nos Estados Unidos, em relação às demandas laborais. Se existe um acesso total, amplo e restrito, ou também se existe algum tipo de necessidade de cumprir fórmulas, de cumprir pagamento de custas e etc.
I would say, am I on now? In the United States, we do not have specialized labor courts. And in fact, we have the opposite problem of too much accessibility. Our problem, which I mentioned briefly, is that everybody who goes to work will sign a contract that says, if I am subject to sexual harassment, if I am subject to, bullying, if I am subject to too much work that's illegal, I cannot go to court. I have to submit to arbitration, and the arbitration will be conducted mostly by people who are more sympathetic to the business than they are to the workers.
Eu queria só pedir a complacência da plateia, porque nós não podemos atrasar, porque nós temos palestrantes que têm horário de avião, etc. Então, professor Sérgio Bermudes, se me permitir que eu passe para o encerramento desse painel, tá? Só para que a gente não atrase. Mas eu agradeço a contribuição, né, da doutora magistrada, que foi muito boa e mostra a diferença, né, as realidades culturais e sistêmicas que são diferentes entre o Brasil e os Estados Unidos, né, e faz a gente pensar muito sobre isso também. Eu queria, então, aproveitar esse momento do encerramento desse painel, porque eu gostaria de fazer uma homenagem ao professor Bryant Garth, se me permitirem também. Professor Bryant Garth, it's an honor for me as a representative of School of Judges to, as a sign of appreciation and admiration, give you this plaque that says Professor Dr. Bryant Garth, as the first distinguished professor guest, a prominent figure in the field of law, internationally known for his pioneering work on access to justice. So I would like to give you this plaque. E eu vou passar também o certificado para os nossos componentes aqui da mesa, o professor Dr. Sérgio Bermudes, que me permitam que entregue em mãos para ele. Deixa eu pegar aqui para o professor Bryant Garth. E antes de encerrar, eu só gostaria de fazer um anúncio, eu quero aproveitar essa oportunidade, que o professor Bryant Garth estava vindo para cá e já conversei com o pessoal da Emerj. Eu acho que a Escola da Magistratura tem uma vocação que é inescondível, que é de realizar pesquisas. Mais do que uma escola de magistrados, onde nós temos palestras, cursos variados, nós somos um centro de conhecimento. E como um centro de conhecimento, não podemos abrir mão de fazer pesquisas. O professor Dr. Bryant Garth veio aqui e nos deixou claro que hoje não se pode fazer um estudo sério na magistratura sobre qualquer tema se a gente não tiver amparado em pesquisas empíricas. Por isso que decidimos na Escola da Magistratura que vamos criar um centro de pesquisas. Já temos um núcleo de pesquisas, que é o NUPEGRE, que cuida de questões de gênero e raça, mas me parece que nós temos que ampliar. Temos que ter um núcleo de pesquisas que fale, por exemplo, sobre mediação. O nosso querido desembargador, Dr. César Cury, já vai ficar à frente disso aqui. Temos que ter um centro de pesquisas que fale sobre direitos humanos. Temos que ter um centro de pesquisa que fale sobre o Poder Judiciário, que pesquise o Judiciário, com os dados disponíveis que nós temos. Então, quero aproveitar a presença aqui do professor Bryant Garth nessa oportunidade para anunciar que a Escola da Magistratura está criando um centro de pesquisas permanente e vai abrir vários núcleos, várias frentes, para pesquisar temas que são fundamentais, importantes para a magistratura. Então, dito isso, eu gostaria de agradecer mais uma vez a presença aqui dos professores Bryant Garth, a quem eu entrego aqui um DVD com a sua palestra, e agradecer também a presença do meu querido professor, amigo, mestre, Dr. Sérgio Bermudes, e agradecer a plateia. Muito obrigado.